All right. So hopefully you can see this.
Yes.
What? Okay, good. um, yeah, okay. So here we go with writing essays in the UK. So first, actually, we wanted to ask, what do you think makes a good essay? I'm sure you've all written a lot of essays. Maybe not necessarily here, but um, I'm sure there are some common elements that make them good. So yeah, would anyone like to share?
Feel
Um,
free to use the chat if you want to.
can I? Yeah. So basically, I think it would be introduction and few paragraphs, and also a conclusion. But I don't really know what to write during the, like between the introduction and conclusion.
Yeah, but that's a good structure to start with. Any other suggestions?
We have some comments in the chat.
Okay.
Clear structure, good content, evidence, references, clear ideas, and evidence to support opinions, coherence, good use of language, writing critically, no plagiarism.
Yeah, those are a lot of good suggestions.
Good grammar.
Nice. So it seems like you all have a good basic understanding of what we need in an essay. But now to focus a little bit more on maybe some UK specific requirements. So some of the expectations. First, we have clarity, structure, and strength of argument. So the argument is really important. This really kind of gives purpose to your whole essay. And this is the stance or the angle you take on the topic. Then we have breadth and relevance of sources and case study material. So it's important to have a variety of sources to show that you've done a lot of research. You also want to make sure that your sources are good quality, so from a respected journal or other respected source. Also with sources, sometimes it can be useful to include sources that take a different stance than you do to show that you've considered all sides of the argument and to show that you're really able to think critically about the topic. Then we have appreciation of theory and key concepts relevant to the argument, if applicable. So this kind of gives a foundation for your argument. So maybe thinking about what you've learned in lectures or what you've read, but just being able to demonstrate that you have the necessary background to formulate this argument. And then we have independent criticism, which is critical, evaluative, or an analytical approach taken to sources. So here you want to evaluate the sources, maybe discuss what they do well, or maybe what they're lacking, but just to show that you've thought about them and again, how they relate to your argument. Something that kind of goes along with this is originality and independence. So innovation and creativity in response to the question. So with this, you want to show that you have a background, you have a lot of good sources, but that you can kind of take your own angle and bring your own voice to the essay. And then finally, presentation, just the standard language and referencing. Make sure your grammar, spelling, punctuation, and references are correct. So starting with the argument, again, this is kind of what gives focus to your essay. It's the purpose. And this should be clearly stated in 1 or 2 lines in the introduction and conclusion. Sometimes you might have heard of this as being called a thesis statement. An example would be something like, through an analysis of several leading studies, this essay argues that universities should offer healthier food choices. And so again, you'd want to make sure that you say this towards the start of the essay, and then also reiterate it again at the end. And the aim of the argument is to show that you can think critically about the topic and come to an original and independent conclusion. So again, not just restating exactly what your sources have said, but putting some thought and originality into it. Maybe considering both sides of an argument or adding some extra element to the essay question to make it your own.
Anna, I'm really sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
There was one comment in the chat that I think one person has difficulty hearing. Maybe it's a technical problem, I'm not sure. But they suggested maybe if you can speak a bit louder. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, that's good because I can't see the chat in screen sharing mode. So thanks. Okay. So another useful tool, maybe if I hold my microphone closer, that would be better. But another useful tool that you can use in your essay writing is signposting. So this refers to using phrases and words to guide the reader through the content of the essay or dissertation. And it helps make the point of the essay clear and obvious to the reader. So some examples of this are on the next slide. So suppose we have an essay which is discuss the idea that animals should be kept in zoos. Starting with the introduction, we could have something like, this essay will explore whether animals belong in zoos. The essay will be split into 2 parts. Firstly, the benefits, and secondly, the disadvantages. And this essay will argue that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. So here, what's written in orange is examples of signposting. So just very clear statements about what you're going to do in the essay. Now moving on to the body paragraphs, which introduce the ideas and explore the topic in depth. And here, each body paragraph should have its own point. So yeah, limit yourself to 1 idea per paragraph. So some examples. The first benefit that needs to be explored is the fact that zoos provide a safe environment for endangered species. The second benefit of zoos are that animals have ready access to medical care if they need it. Small typo there. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages to zoos. One disadvantage is that removing animals from their natural habitats is cruel. And another disadvantage is that animals can develop health problems from being in captivity. So again, here, these are 4 different body paragraphs. And we look at both sides of the argument, so the benefits and the disadvantages, to show that you've really considered the whole argument. And then finally, the conclusion, which reiterates what you've discussed and shows that you've answered the question. So something like the evidence above leads to the conclusion that zoos offer more benefits than disadvantages. And of course, when you're writing a full essay, it will be much longer than this, but this is kind of a good skeleton to use to help structure it in general. So now we've come to our first activity. We're going to put you into breakout rooms where you can either work as a group or work individually to practice structuring an essay like we did on the previous slide. And I'll go back to that so you can review it quickly before we go off into the rooms. But with this, you can choose one of the topics listed here. So should texting and driving be illegal? Is studying abroad worth it? Should schools stop giving homework? Is social media damaging young people's mental health? Or you can just make up your own topic. Maybe there's something you're currently working on that you wanted to practice. You can feel free to do that. But we'll go into the rooms, use one of these topics, and then structure it sort of along these lines. We'll only take, I think, about 10 minutes to do this, so we don't expect anything really detailed, but maybe just a few bullet points explaining what the essay will do and how it's organized. So an introduction, a couple of body paragraphs potentially, and then a conclusion. Okay. So before we go into the breakout rooms, are there any questions?
Sorry. When you said texting and driving, does that mean texting while driving?
Yeah,
Oh yeah, thank you.
no problem. Okay. So now that we've talked about structuring essays, we now need to look at structuring paragraphs, or the units of the essay. So paragraphs divide the essay into manageable chunks, the fundamental unit of the essay, and they act as both a structural and visual device because they only address one point, and so it's easy for the reader to see when you transition from paragraph to paragraph. They're also able to, mentally make note that you're switching to a different point. So a paragraph is like a mini essay, and one effective way of structuring them is the Peel method, which Maria is going to discuss now.
Hi everyone, just give me a moment to share my screen with you. 1 second. So the Peel method is a way in which you can effectively and easily structure your paragraphs. So Peel is an acronym and it stands for Point, Evidence, Explain, and Link. So you start your paragraph by introducing your point. So this would be your main argument that you're going to talk about in your paragraph, but stated clearly in one sentence. Then you would continue your paragraph by adding the evidence to support your point. So here, for example, you can talk about any research studies or any newspaper articles that support what you have just said. Of course, this evidence needs to be paraphrased, or if you want to quote them directly from the source, you need to put quotation marks, and you will definitely need to have references here. Then we move on to one very important part, the explain. So here you need to talk about how and why this evidence supports your point and what you think of it. So in other words, here you need to give your own opinion of the evidence, and you need to apply your critical thinking and say whether you think this evidence is good, if you think it's not good, what are the strengths of it and what are the limitations. This is something that you need to do in your essays. You need to critically evaluate the evidence that you bring up, and don't be afraid to criticize something. And finally, you link what you have just said back to your overall argument. Here we are going to see a simple example of what we've just talked about of the peel. So let's assume we are writing an essay about whether animals should be kept in zoos or not. So we start by stating our point. First of all, removing wild animals from their natural habitats is incredibly cruel. Then we move on to supporting with evidence. When kept captive, these beautiful creatures become bored and lonely, often leading to a condition called zoochosis. Animals suffering from zoochosis begin performing anxious, repetitive acts such as rocking back and forth, swaying, grooming themselves excessively, and vomiting. Here, of course, you would need to have references within brackets. The example doesn't have that, but you would need to have that. Then we go on to explain the evidence. Conditions such as this clearly demonstrate that wild animals belong in the wilderness, not in restrictive prison-like enclosures. So here we say what we think of the evidence. So here the author thinks that this is very good evidence and that they prove the point. And then we link it to the overall argument. Animals must be freed from zoos now so that this terrible suffering and mental torture end for good. Now we're going to talk a bit more about the critical analysis because that's a very important aspect of your academic writing. And it's something that usually your examiners will look for in order to give you a very high mark first. So critical analysis is carefully considering an idea and weighting up the evidence supporting it to see if it is convincing. Then you need to be able to logically explain why you find the evidence convincing or unconvincing. And in other words, is disagreeing or agreeing with the evidence with reason. It's okay to not completely agree with the evidence and not completely disagree. Your opinion can be somewhere in the middle. That's totally fine. And as I've said before, just because something comes from a reliable source or from a published study, it doesn't mean it doesn't have limitations. And if you think that something hasn't been done properly or something should be improved or something should be expanded upon, you need to say that in your essay. Of course, critical analysis is not only about the limitations, it's also about the strengths. And if you think some evidence is very good for some reasons, that's also something that you can say. And it's really important for your essay to critically evaluate your evidence. Here are some points to consider when we first read sources and we want to critically evaluate them. So firstly, the authority of the author. So who is this person who wrote this source and are they an expert on the topic? Then the date of publication. Usually we don't want publications that are very old because they may not relate to what's happening today. The publisher. So is this, for example, an academic journal that published this paper? The journal or magazine. So here you can consider things such as the impact factor of a journal, for example. And of course, the content. Some more things we can look at is the intended audience. So some sources may be intended for research audience or the general public. then we need to also think if the author is making well-reasoned argument backed up by facts. So do they cite any sources? Can you verify the sources? Can you look at them yourself? And does it sound like what the author has said is accurate? Does the information appear valid and well-researched? And again, is it backed up by evidence? Can you detect any bias on the part of the author? So for example, you may have a research study where the authors, they make their conclusions appear as more groundbreaking than they really are. And this is some bias on their part. So that's something which is good to be aware of. So does the work update other sources? Does it add new information? That's also an important thing to think about. Is the material primary, such as first-hand accounts, government documents, newspaper articles, scientific research reports, or is it secondary, such as books or encyclopedia articles? When you look at a secondary source such as a book that, for example, mentions some academic studies, it's a good idea to look at the primary resource. So read the study that they talk about yourself and try to evaluate yourself, because you may not agree with the perspective of the author of the book. And finally, is the work logically organized? Are the main points clearly presented? Is the work easy to read? Does it flow logically, or is it choppy? That's also a good indicator of whether it's a good quality work. So now we're going to do our second exercise. We are going to do this in a big group. We are going to share one article, actually, the first page of one article, which is about texting and driving. And so try to critically evaluate what you read by keeping in your mind factors such as the intended audience, the facts that they present, whether they have any bias, the information they give, the materials they used, and the organization of the text. I think we can have 5 minutes for you to read the source, and which I'm going to put up right now, and then you can share your views, or you can tell us what you think, or you can use the chat.
Really
So
quick,
this is the article.
we have
Yes.
a comment in the chat, or a question. Are there tools that can be used to examine the strength of evidence for journals or papers?
I'm not aware of any tools, but do you have anything in mind, Anna?
I mean, nothing concretely. Yeah. I think maybe some ideas will come out of the discussion we have about this paper,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, I think it's some yeah, we can talk about this in the discussion a bit more. Yeah, for sure. We can talk about this more later. read it and if you have any thoughts about it.
I think that yeah, can I tell
mais ça, c'est quand tu
what
regardes
I
sur
thought
Reddit.
about this text?
Ouais, non, mais ça, il y a un bug sur Reddit,
Can you hear me?
ça. Mais en gros, mec,
Yes, I can hear you.
c'est sur,
Yeah, okay. So in the text, I found that it's written by, it's at the top, it's written American Economic Journal. So it should be for an audience of well-educated people or people who have a degree. Additionally, it is written with lots of facts. There are many figures about period of times. For instance, distracted drivers from the period 2004 to 2008, or 25,000 fatalities. And so because of the facts, there's a lot of information that is provided in this document. And yeah, that's the main things I saw in this text, in this document.
Thank you very much. These are very good points. Yes, it is published in the American Economic Journal, so it's meant for people with a lot of knowledge on economics. It does use facts. It has, at the end, which we can see, a full reference list. So yeah, thank you. These are very good points. Anybody else?
Can I share my ideas?
Of course.
Yeah, so since this journal is from the American Economic Journal, so I'm assuming that it's for Americans because all the facts and figures are from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This is a organization which is based in the US, so the audience may be US, and the facts are from the US as well. And I think it's a bias in relation to texting bans and fatal accidents on roadways, and they're not giving the viewpoint of those who text while driving, and they think that it's right to text while driving because it's important. So it's really biased, and the info the material provided is also biased because they're only figures from one organization, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and there are no other figures. And it's organized in the sense that it's paragraphed and it's giving references and stuff like that, like NHTSA 2009. But at the same time, I think they're flooding their ideas, but they're not giving a very good analysis in the entire paper. This is what I think.
Yes, thank you very much. That's also a good example of critical thinking. So again, they only talked about the United States and they've used only one source of information. Maybe they could have used more sources of data. They don't give us maybe the reasons why people might be texting and driving. So yeah, there may be bias on their side, or maybe they're not considering all of the perspective. Thank you very much. So moving on. So now, just to talk a little bit about the writing itself. Of course, this depends on what you're writing, and it also depends on the instructions that your department has given you. But usually for academic essays, it's best to use passive voice over active voice. So very rarely in an academic essay, you would use phrases such as, I think, I feel, I believe, I am sure. You wouldn't use I. That's something many of you might already know, of course. Instead, you can use statements such as, it could be argued that, in the light of the evidence, it is obvious that, it can be concluded that. So always preferable to use passive voice. And finally, some general advice for your writing. So as we've discussed before, an argument doesn't have to come down on one side or the other. So you don't have to completely agree with something or completely disagree with something. In fact, most of the times, because the things you will talk about in your essays are very complex, a good argument might be a bit in the middle and might be a bit more complicated. That's completely fine. Then, if you find yourself having trouble to formulate a thought on paper, that might be because actually it's not one argument, it's more than one argument, it's 2 or 3 that you are trying to express. So try breaking it up into several sentences. Then, if you have difficulty to work out how to structure an essay, try writing some small key sentences showing the development of the argument in its simplest form. So in the previous example that we had with animals and zoos, we could go, animals should not be kept in zoos, full stop. Zoos can make animals feel sad. Start by writing some key sentences, small and simple. And these sentences can be the first sentence of your paragraph. And then when you have elaborated and you have your main argument and it does make sense, you can work a bit more on your writing and you can try and make them more complex and you can make them sound nicer. This key sentence approach can also be useful when you've written your essay and you want to test its flow and whether it has a good structure. So what you can do is you can take these key sentences of each paragraph and you can try read them out and you can test whether these logically make sense to you. If it does logically make sense to you, then your essay has a good structure. If not, then maybe that's something that you need to work on. And to conclude, here are some good sources that you can look at in order to help you improve your writing. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. I think I'm going to stop sharing now. And maybe now we can also stop the recording and we can take some questions. Again, thank you very much for joining and hope you found it useful.